There are few certainties in British politics, but since the 1970s, one of them has been that it is easy to be elected as an MP in Glasgow, as long as you are standing for Labour. The party's roots here go back decades, back to the time when the area was known as Red Clydeside. Labour's Donald Dewar, Scotland's first ever First Minister, was born here, and his statue even now peers down over the city's busy shopping streets. At the 2010 election, the party secured majorities of over 10,000 in every constituency in this city except one.
It was a major shock to the party, therefore, when Glasgow, Scotland's biggest city, was one of only 2 areas in the country to vote yes to independence at last year's referendum. While the country as a whole voted 55-45 in favour of staying within the United Kingdom, here in Glasgow they voted 53-47 in favour of leaving. And it was even more of a shock when a slew of polls predicted that Labour could be wiped out across Glasgow as a whole in May 2015. The most recent poll suggests that here in Glasgow South West, the SNP is currently around 3 points ahead of Labour, a huge turnaround from the last election when the sitting MP Ian Davidson retained this seat on 62% of the vote. It seems that now, for the first time in living memory, Labour could be about to lose out in its own industrial heartland.
Recently, because we've had a Labour government, a lot of people disillusioned, unhappy with Blair, unhappy with the Iraq war, feel that there's a simple solution just simply by voting nationalist. Now, it's our job to explain that life's a bit more complex than that, but it's understandable that many people who feel that life isn't treating them particularly well are accepting the sort of panaceas that the nationalists are offering.
Labour's collapse in Glasgow is the most acute symptom of a problem the party has across the whole of Scotland. For decades, Scottish voters could be relied on to return dozens of Labour MPs to Westminster. The party won 41 out of 59 seats contested here in 2010. But in the last few years, that position has been chipped away, and the referendum on Scottish independence last September only seems to have exacerbated that trend. This is especially palpable in working class areas like Govan or the nearby Gorbals, where Vic Brown, an artist who uses the Galgale Community Centre as her studio, has lived for most of her life.
Pretty sure this came from trees from Holyrood in Edinburgh. I voted Labour early on, years ago, and I'd never do it again. They've lost all trust. I think a lot of Labour voters that have always voted Labour and come from families that have always voted Labour will not vote for them. And they're just using the same scare tactics as they did in the referendum, because all the No campaign had was scare tactics, and that's all that Labour can offer.
While Galgale brings to life Govan's shipbuilding past, much of the employment nowadays is provided by the hulking shipyards on the Clyde. These yards rely on government contracts awarded in London for much of their work, which the coalition government threatened to cancel if Scotland voted for independence. The links between the unions here and the Labour Party remain, but Billy Mackay, convener for the Unite Union at the Govan Yard, admits there are signs that they are weakening.
I've always voted Labour through my working class guy. I've always voted Labour. But I've concerns about how the Labour Party is run at times. I believe Labour has lost links with the working class. I don't feel they're the same grassroots that they had before. At the end of the day, people, you can only take people so far, and if they feel they're getting not getting the service that should be provided, then they'll make judgments on that, and woe betide you if you don't come up to the mark.
What makes Labour's decline so surprising here in Glasgow South West is that this is traditionally the Protestant area of town, home to Glasgow Rangers FC, and previously a bastion of support for the union. And while sectarianism may be fading, this remains an unlikely place for the SNP to flourish.
We've just had a referendum campaign where Pollock, this constituency, had the highest individual number of yes voters in Glasgow with 26,807. If they all vote SNP in May, we will win this constituency.
As Labour moved rightwards under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, the SNP began to occupy the space to the left, campaigning heavily on issues such as increased usage of food banks and the coalition's so-called bedroom tax. Here at Glasgow South West Food Bank, volunteers are listening to that message.
I voted SNP in 2010, and having previously voted Labour in the previous 3 elections and Liberal or Liberal Democrat before that, I will be voting SNP again Historically in Scotland there has been more of a left of centre consensus, and the main political parties that are competing in the Scottish seats in the next general election are left of centre. And with that consensus, the more control there is within Scotland of Scottish affairs, the more likely it is that that consensus can be expressed in policies that are more inclusive, are fairer, more equitable.
In its effort to wrest political momentum away from the SNP, Labour recently appointed Jim Murphy, the former Scotland Secretary, as its leader in Scotland.
My sense of the polls will change, but they'll change relatively late. And it's about that sense of patriotism, confidence, self-belief, and genuinely being the party that says, here's the changes we're going to make. And I think this will be a change election rather than a risk election.
People like Owen Fenn, who runs an immigration drop-in centre in Govan, might normally have been expected to follow his parents' example and turn out loyally for Labour. But he was unimpressed by what he saw as the Westminster elite campaigning for a no vote last September, and is now deciding whether to vote SNP or Green.
So in terms of the referendum campaign, I think maybe the Scottish people didn't like the way that was done. So for example, the three amigos of Miliband, Cameron and Clegg, I don't think Scotland particularly liked the three of them coming together. And the Better Together campaign, which was funded by both the Conservatives and Labour, I think to some extent the core Labour vote felt a little bit betrayed.
Labour thinks this is an unfair characterisation.
Well, I don't think we did actually campaign all that closely with the Tories. I mean, and the SNP are using this. They have got a very, very good propaganda machine, which is able to tar us with this brush. Certainly in my constituency, there were no sign of Tories.
In its effort to overturn the current state of the polls, Labour will rely on the campaigning organisation it has built up over years of controlling this area. Labour's other big hope is to turn the contest into a straight shootout, forcing voters to choose between them and a second Tory-led Westminster government.
The argument that voting SNP will only yield a Conservative government hasn't been resonating with voters in Scotland the way it has in previous general elections. Usually in Scottish general elections, people vote quite differently from how they do in Scottish elections. It becomes a UK election, and who's the Prime Minister is the dominant question. This election so far seems different, but as we get closer to the vote, when the UK media increasingly concentrates on UK-wide issues and people start to see that kind of binary choice, things might change, but we haven't seen evidence of that yet.
Over the next few weeks, Labour will play heavily on the unpopularity of the Conservatives here in Glasgow and across Scotland as a whole. They'll tell wavering voters not to vote SNP because doing so would only let David Cameron back into number 10. The question is whether those voters are now so fed up with both parties they're no longer listening. Kiran Stacey, Financial Times, Glasgow.